Hello and welcome to The Road to Copenhagen. I'm Susan McGinnis, here with Executive Editor Margaret Ryan, and right now we are talking about how we got here, meaning how global leaders got to this current decision point. Margaret, take us back to the start of when scientists first started noticing the rise in temperatures, and this happened as early as the 1960s and 70s.
That's right, Susan, and by the mid-1980s, a scientific consensus was growing that the emissions into the atmosphere were not only damaging in the short term, they were first looking at things like particulates and acid rain, but in the long term, carbon concentrations, which had been in the atmosphere at about 275 parts per million at the beginning of the industrial age, they were at about 350 parts per million, and they were going up at an accelerating rate.
So at this point, science had pinpointed carbon as a culprit, even though it's naturally occurring in the atmosphere, simply because of the burning of fossil fuels. And did they already have a limit or a maximum on what was dangerous as far as parts per million?
That's still developing. That's still in scientific debate about what exactly might be dangerous. The problem was the balance. The balance in the atmosphere between the carbon being put in there, and increasing amounts were as we burned more fossil fuels, and the amount of carbon being taken out. We were actually inhibiting nature's ability to take carbon out because we're paving over more stuff and we're cutting down trees. Tropical forests were going. So it was throwing everything completely out of balance, and the worry was more carbon in the atmosphere. Carbon's a reflective, and it meant as sunlight came in and struck the Earth, instead of going back out into space, it was being reflected back, and the heat load in the atmosphere was growing.
Okay, so as far as science goes, the problem is found. Then we know that in 1988, two UN organizations, the World Meteorological Organization and the UN Environment Program, they established, this is what we hear about every day, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and this is where all of the research began.
Well, they were really compilers of research, and yeah, we certainly have heard of them. They're the Nobel Prize winners along with Vice President Al Gore. What they did was get hundreds of scientists to chip in and volunteer, in some cases their time, but also to pull together all of the research that was being done in different countries, different parts of the world. And you know, we have no scientist that I know of who claims everything's known, but you had a lot of researchers who were trying to figure out just how climate works and to model things and the mechanisms, what happens with the oceans, what happens with the atmosphere. But you know, by 1990, after only 2 years, the IPCC was able to put out its first report, and that report said there's a growing consensus that yes, indeed, there is a problem, and global warming is at least tentatively attributable to the excess carbon that humans are putting into the atmosphere.
Okay, so over time the evidence starts to grow that global warming is happening and that human activity is causing it, and it's still going on today. I mean, we're seeing studies all the time coming out from the UN and others talking about the situation becoming more dire, and that a lot of the damage, you know, already will occur. There's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah. Well, the last IPCC update was in 2007, and that showed, you know, as each report has come out, in fact, there's been an increasing warning that it's looking worse, it's looking worse. And the one in 2007 was the strongest yet. First, it said global warming's happening, that there's an increasing consensus. It's due to human activity. That was another strong thing. The thing is, it's not only happening, it's happening faster than they thought it would. Those models from 1988, 1990, they weren't near good enough to predict what we're actually seeing happen now. Carbon concentrations in 2008 rose to 386 parts per million. The global mean temperature in the last 150 years has risen by 3/4 of a degree Celsius. That doesn't sound like much, but that's spread over the entire atmosphere, which is a huge system. And it's led to warnings that the carbon emissions need to be cut as quickly as possible, because carbon has a long residence time in the atmosphere. That means that right now some warming will occur because of the carbon that's already up there, and the best thing we can do is start cutting back as soon as possible.
Okay, so all of this research under the auspices of the IPCC, the situation's becoming more dire. This finally leads to a very quick agreement, and this happened in Rio.
That's right. It was 2 years, and everybody says for an international treaty treaty. That's really fast. It was in Rio de Janeiro. President George H.W. Bush signed that treaty for the United States. The treaty formally created the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and that's what everything else since is happening under that framework. It's kind of an umbrella treaty. And in the Rio Treaty, the world's governments recognized that there is a problem, and they pledged to do their part about it. But it didn't have a lot of specifics.
Right. Okay. So the Rio Treaty is the UNFCCC. It established that framework from which future agreements were made under.
That's right.
But it had a lot of holes in it, placeholders, I guess.
Pretty much like some of the negotiating texts we're seeing now in Copenhagen, or for Copenhagen. The big questions about who would cut carbon output, how the reductions would be paid for, and help to countries that really couldn't pay for it, the developing countries in particular. All that was left to further negotiations, and it was 5 more years before there were any results. But the Rio Treaty itself, that's what the world's building on in Copenhagen.
All right, a fascinating look at history. Margaret Ryan, thank you so much for that backgrounder on how we got here. One of several backgrounders on the road to Copenhagen Clean Skies News is providing. Click on any of these to find out all you need to know about the global talks coming up in December.